Buenas tardes. Welcome, everyone. We're very happy to have you join us today to discuss this incredible work, The Undocumented Americans by Karla Trujillo, Karla Conejo, perdón, Villavicencio. Professor Vaquera, Valdivia, and I are very happy to welcome you to this discussion. My name is Manuel Cuellar. I'm assistant professor of Latin American language and literature in the Romance, German, and Slavic Languages and Literatures department. Would you like to introduce yourselves, please?
Okay. Well, again, welcome everybody. My name is Victor Valdivia. I am professor too in the program of Spanish language. Yeah, we're very happy that you were able to join us today. Thank you.
Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Just to start, I'm Elizabeth Vaquera. I'm a professor in sociology, public policy, and those at GW probably know me best as the director of the Cisneros Hispanic Leadership Institute. So I'm very excited to talk about this book, these topics, as we'll talk more about it later, but I've been doing research on undocumented young adults for almost 15 years now. So this is something that I'm very, very interested in, and I'm very close to personally and research-wise to what I do. The program today, and Manuel and Victor say more if you want to, it's going to be in English, pero podemos contestar preguntas en español. Los panelistas hablamos los dos idiomas, so you can ask your questions in English or in Spanish. Pueden preguntar tanto en español como en inglés, e intentaremos acomodar ambos lenguajes. So we are happy to accommodate both English and Spanish as needed.
And before moving on with the actual topic of the book and the discussion about it, I just want to talk a little bit about this kind of conversation, kind of book club that Manuel and I started last semester. So our idea was to have a space for students that are taking Spanish, but also students across campus that are interested in maybe practicing their Spanish or just learning more about different social, linguistic, political issues that affect the Hispanic Latino community in the United States. We don't really have a fixed decision regarding the language that we want to use. The first conversation that we had was actually in Spanish, based on the book that we discussed that time. So rather that saying this is going to be in Spanish, this is going to be in English, we prefer that students kind of dictate the language that we're going to be speaking. So feel free to speak any of those. Manuel, anything else that you would like to say?
This year's was also designed as a space, just to reiterate, as a space to create a space for us to engage in dialogue and address current and relevant issues related to the Spanish-speaking and Latin American Latinx communities. And this is a virtual space at the moment, but obviously once we are able to return back to campus, we'll be able to do it in person. And we're very happy that the Cisneros Institute is co-sponsoring this event, and we're very happy, Professor. Well, we'll call each other by our first name. So Eli is joining us today. So yes, I think it's very important that we, as a community in DC, we're able to open up a space in order to engage in this kind of dialogue. And Eli, would you like to add anything else?
Yeah, as a sociologist, something that I study in undocumented populations, one thing that is very important for us in choosing this book is to bring this idea of humanizing the immigrant. When you watch the news, you see a lot of numbers, whether we have 11 million undocumented in the United States, whether there are 5,000 individuals right now in the border, or 500 families who are separated, or this many people deported. We see the information that comes to us, whether from politicians or from the news, it tends to be a lot about numbers, or it tends to be about criminal behavior. Very little or seldom we see stories in which immigrants are humanized. And even less, the average immigrant humanized. If you see stories of humanization of immigrants, it's always like the exception to the rule. We have our Rhodes Scholar or our Harvard scholar, but very little you hear about the everyday person that also is part of the social fabric of this country, which tends to be invisible. So that's one of the reasons that the three of us chose this book, to bring and to shed light to who are those immigrants that live in this country and they're part of it, and not to talk about them in terms of numbers, but rather to the humanity and what they bring to our communities, and take them out of that invisibility.
Okay, so I think we're ready to start like the official presentation. The first part of the presentation, we're going to share part of Karla's history, her work, and then each one of us will address a specific topic or main theme. And so if you can play to get to know a little bit more about the author.
When Karla was 1.5 years old, her parents left her in their native Ecuador in the care of family members while they emigrated to New York City. The plan was that they would work for 1 year to save up enough money to pay off their debt, and then they'd come home. But barely making ends meet, 1 year turned into 4, so they decided to have Karla join them in their new home. She was just about to turn 5 years old. Growing up away from her parents would have a permanent effect on Karla and shape her and her work to this very day.
Therapist after therapist told me I had attachment issues and that my mental illnesses were related to my childhood.
Karla is a DACA recipient, and at least on paper, she's the realization of the American dream for immigrant parents. She went to Harvard. Now she's pursuing a PhD at Yale. But the constant pressure to be the perfect, high-achieving, hard-working child has oftentimes been a mental health nightmare for Karla.
Once you hear your parents come home and their body is wrecked at the end of the day, and you know they've earned like very little money, and they look at you and they say, "I do this for you," you can't forget that for the rest of your life. And you're bound to them.
I sat down with Karla to talk about intergenerational wounds, mental health in the Latinx community, and how we can take care of each other.
Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to share with you today is that this book is a result of a long history of Karla's reflection on her own experience. She published in 2010 in the Daily Beast while she was at Harvard this essay that became very popular and well read. "I'm an illegal immigrant at Harvard." She was asked to then write a memoir, which she, 21 years old, and she thought that she wasn't ready for it. But then when after the election of Donald Trump, she woke up to a different reality, and she decided to continue to explore this topic of how to write a story about undocumented Americans in the United States. And part of the context that I want you to keep in mind throughout this presentation is that last year was also when the American Dirt controversy. And so American Dirt is a novel about migration by Jenny Cummins, in the context where Latinx people only comprise 3% of the publishing industry. So we have to understand that this is part of the 3% of Latinx individuals or writers in the publishing industry. And I think we have to keep that in mind. We also have to keep in mind the fact that we need to grapple with the idea of how is it to write from a place of shared trauma. How is it to write and share with others memories, pain? And I think this is something that she renders very beautifully and in very complex and sophisticated ways, as we're going to be showing. Can we get the next slide? So that some of the things that are going to be addressing today are going to be dealing with the issue of belonging, mental health, nouns and commodification, the notion of the American dream, and the construction of memory, histories, and ways of remembering. The stories are divided, this book is divided into several chapters featuring different stories from different people. With narratives and docu-narratives from New York, Flint, Miami, Cleveland, and New Haven. So it is very interesting, the selection of these communities and these spaces. And now I leave you with Victor, who get us started.
Thank you, Manuel. Can you advance to the next slide, please? Okay. So I choose this quote because, well, as a linguist, for me, it's always very revealing what kind of words writers and people choose to speak about themselves, but also what words, what nouns, what adjectives other people choose, even realizing that they're choosing those words or not to speak about other people, about other population. So this particular quote is very relevant for me because Karla is refusing to use the term undocumented workers or, of course, illegal workers. She's against that completely, but also against undocumented workers, not per se by the undocumented part of that phrase, but by the workers. By doing that, what we are doing, or what society is doing, is seeing this group of individuals not as a people, but something to be traded. They have value just because they can do work that nobody else wants to do. So that's the reaction about for this particular phrase, undocumented workers. She continues this quote later and says that she would prefer that people be rude and politically incorrect if that means seeing people as people, as individuals, not just like a merchandise, as a commodity to use in the economy. So that's a very powerful quote for me. And yeah, I think words matters, and this is one of those examples.
To add to that, is thinking of the implication that she puts here of like the people talking or being presented as undocumented workers is something that we've seen in history. Immigrants are always thought, or they are justified in the United States as their contributions to their economy, and this is an example of that. And we forget that they bring way more than contributions to the economy. They bring contributions to our culture, to our food, to our history. And by bringing, as she says, the euphemism of workers, we are erasing all those other contributions that they bring to the country and to who we are and what we become over time.
We're focusing just on that particular aspect instead of looking the whole, everything they bring with them, and all the other ways that they enrich the society and the culture and the community. I don't know if anyone has anything else to add. Well, if not, okay, I will continue. I didn't have a quote for the next noun that I want to talk about, but it's something that all of you, I'm sure, know about it or are familiar with that situation. Maybe is the fact that children of immigrants always, very often, have to translate for their parents, so they're translators. But when Karla was assigned, or when Karla started this project, the issue for her was that, what do I want to do as a translator? I don't want to approach the people I'm going to talk about, or the people I'm going to talk with. I don't want to approach them as a typical translator that will ask them questions and then pass that into English without modifying the syntax. And I think that's very important, because sometimes journalists, sometimes writers, in order to be objective and in order to really communicate what the informants are telling. They choose to, rather than transliterate, to transcribe exactly the words that these people are communicating. And when they do that, they present the speech of these individuals like first or second grade speech, like they speak a very basic English or very basic Spanish. And I know that they do that because they want to be objective, but they kind of go against the purpose that they should have when they are presenting these people to the whole public. And I mean, if you had the curiosity of recording yourselves when you're talking with your friends, when you're having an informal conversation, and then go back and listen that exchange, that conversation, you won't be surprised of how many incomplete sentences you produce, how many change of topics you did during that conversation, how bad that language seems after we listen, after we go back. So by really just reproducing the exact words that informants are saying, but being transcribers instead of translators, instead of cultural translators, I think journalists, writers don't do a favor to the immigrant community. Then that's why Karla chooses not to do that. She chooses to approach her translation as if she were translating poetry. So she takes the whole idea, she takes the whole feeling of that conversation, and then present that conversation to us instead of just transcribing word by word. So I think that's also very important, and that's something that we, the general community, the general society, don't think about very often when thinking about immigrants and their struggles with language every day. Well, the next now I want to talk about, the next issue I want to talk about is American Dream. American Dream. Can you advance to the next slide? Thank you. So again, this is a very frequent topic that comes into conversation when we are talking about immigrants, when we're talking about, as Ellie said a little bit before, the ideal immigrant, the immigrant that is not only following, pursuing the American dream, but also that achieves, that get there. However, something that often is missed is that for many people, the American dream is not something that is not their own dream, as in this quote, as this quote said, is the dream of someone else. In this case, is the dream of the parents. So for someone who grew up in this country without being the first generation or second generation immigrant, the American dream is very different, just by the sense that these kids, these children, these individuals have to take care of their parents after a couple of years. And so the second quote in particular, well, sorry, let's start with the first one. The first one, it was very powerful to me because she presents all these things that are common to everybody, like learning English, getting banks, placing second in the Emancipation Proclamation oratory contest. But she sees these things like part of a process that she has to follow in order to get to a goal, to get to a point that is not to be successful, is to be able to take care of their parents, to be able to defend their parents, to be able to take them to the doctor, to give them a good life after these parents cannot work for, they cannot work anymore. So that is very powerful to me. And a big difference that, again, maybe we don't think about that when we think about immigrants, and maybe that not every person who migrates to this country has that same perspective because the circumstances are different for them. Mm. Thank you. I don't know if Eli or Manuel want to add something else. I think there's a question on the chat.
We'll definitely address it, but I think we're going to move on to
Okay.
go through this series of slides. And then, yes, Caro, muchas gracias por la pregunta. Mientras vamos formulando una respuesta. Ahora, Eli, si quieres continuar.
Siguiente slide. Manuel, I thought that you were gonna start with this one. Oh no, I will start with it. Carolina, your question is actually very relevant to this, and I'm gonna answer part of it, but not all of it because it's gonna keep coming up. Let me read this for those of you that are not familiar with the book, and then I'm just gonna throw a couple ideas here, but I would like in the discussion part for us to engage a lot more. Belonging and mental health is the part of research, and we call it emotional well-being because I'm a sociologist, not a psychologist, but it's all related. It's what I've been focusing my research on: Latinos in the United States and immigrants. And young immigrants in the United States. So this is something that I'm particularly interested in. So let me read the quote. And Karla says, "But it's not just those early years without my parents that branded me. It's the life I've led in America as a migrant, watching my parents pursue their dream in this country and then having to deal with its carcass, witnessing the crimes against immigrants carried out by the US government with my hands bound. As an undocumented person, I feel as a hologram. I feel like a hologram. Nothing felt secure. I never felt safe. I didn't allow myself to feel joy because I was scared to attach myself to anything, and I would have anything I would have to let go of. Being deportable meant you have to be ready to go at any moment, ready to go with nothing but the clothes on your body." This is something. There's so much packed in here, but the idea that I want you to leave with, or at least think about in here, it's. One of them is it's how the way we have the laws in the United States, how we treat immigrants, that even when they want to be part of this country, we are not allowing them to create those attachments. So we are not allowing their belonging. In my research, and that it's with young adults like Karla herself, they talk. She says hologram. I had some of my participants in my research talk about being a ghost, being invisible, being you are part of here, but people don't see you. You cannot touch things. You don't have right to things. So she explains it here beautifully. The other thing she talks about is this idea of like, you cannot take anything for granted in how you live your life. She talks about her mixed status family. If you've never heard of that concept, is the idea of that some people in the family might be documented, some undocumented, some might have some intermediate status. So that's a mixed status family, like Karla's family. Her brother is United States citizen. She has DACA. And then her parents are fully undocumented. So we have like a different types of immigrant status in the United States that don't allow her to fully participate of this society or this country, which is all she knows. So this has long-term consequences for their mental health. And if you read the book, she talks about all the mental health diagnoses that she's had, how she treats them. And many of these are they mark or they show how she's been trying to deal with her complex relationship of herself with the country and managing the complex relationship with her parents and her parents with the country in itself. So she talks about self-harm. She talks about some more healthy ways of like talking to friends or having people who are supportive with one another. So we see how immigrants try to make sense and try to create this belonging, both in positive ways and having positive coping mechanisms or healthy coping mechanisms, but she also shows us how many unhealthy coping mechanisms that are very that mark you for life, and that they have very, very, as I was saying, very long-term consequences. One thing, a concept that I would like, she doesn't bring in her research, but I've been writing about, have to do that she, in her story that she brings us, this idea of ontological security. Most of us wake up every day assuming certain things, assuming that our parents are going to be where they are, assuming that, you know, we can go to work, assuming that a paycheck is going to come at the end of the month. Imagine living your life without what I called, or what we've called, like this ontological security, without being able to assume that things today are going to be the same way as they were yesterday. And it's nothing of your doing, it's something out of your control. It's because of this legal violence that is imposed to you as an undocumented immigrant. So that's what she's discussing here, is trying to show us through the experiences of immigrants in what it's called like historical, you know, like typical immigrant destinations like New York, Miami, or like new immigrant destinations like Cleveland, New Haven. So these immigrants in these tenuous and these complicated situations exist throughout our country, and they deal with them in different ways, and they are suffering, and they are trying to live their lives throughout the country. Manuel, I would like for you to continue building of the idea of mental health, because this is much of what the book is talking to us about, and making us see that much of what's happening in this country and how we treat the immigrants affecting their mental health. One thing that I will add before I pass it on to Manuel is this idea of going back to Carolina's question of like the burden on immigrants that we put in a way. You didn't ask us that way. You asked us like the message that she leaves to children of immigrants. I'm not going to talk about that quite now, but one thing that I've been seeing, and Karla doesn't go into this as much, is that there's a lot of burden on immigrant children. And there's a lot of burden on children like Karla, now that she has DACA, that she can work in the United States and she can have access to certain rights that her parents don't have. But now she sees herself as the provider, as the person who is in charge of taking care of their parents because they cannot receive Social Security. So having that DACA comes with a lot of rights. At the same time, it comes with a lot of responsibilities towards those immigrant young adults like Karla herself. Manuel.
Okay, siguiente. Thank you, Elizabeth, for those great ideas that we're going to continue to explore in the conversation, sort of like actual Café Virtual Tertulia part of this. Can we go to the next slide, please? So one of the things that I wanted to share with you today, and this is directly related to how is it that we write about shared pain, shared trauma, shared histories, shared violence. And this is something that is very unique to this book. Well, first of all, there's not many examples, as you can see, because a lot of people simply don't have the access, the exposure, or go to Ivy Leagues in order to get the network needed, right? And so I want us to think about the how, el cómo, the idea of storytelling. How is it that we come across these narratives about undocumented people? So this book, this is her answer. This book is a work of creative nonfiction, rooted in careful reporting, translated as poetry, shared by chosen family, as sometimes hard to read. And can we play the audio for the rest of the quote, please?
Maybe you won't like it. I didn't write it for you to like it. And I did not set out to write anything inspirational, which is why there are no stories of dreamers. They're commendable young people, and I truly owe them my life, but they occupy outsized attention in our politics. I wanted to tell the stories of people who work as day laborers, housekeepers, construction workers, dog walkers, delivery men, people who don't inspire hashtags or t-shirts, but I wanted to learn about them as the weirdos we all are outside of our jobs.
Gracias. And can we go to the next slide, please? And so I just want to give two examples from this chapter on the aftermath of 9/11 in order for us to think about ideas of memory, ideas of history, historia, stories, history, and remembering. And so this is in this particular chapter about 9/11. Karla shares the story of her father. And so this is a brief excerpt of how he describes her father. And please notice the issues, obviously, of masculinity, class, etc. Can we please play the audio?
After my father lost his job as a taxi driver, he found a job as a delivery man at a restaurant down in the financial district. Delivery men in that area call themselves the delivery boys. Throughout my teens, I always corrected my father when he said this, because I assumed the guys had heard it from some white supremacist boss who was trying to emasculate them, and they accepted it as a neutral term. It made me furious. There's a history to white people calling men of color boys, I would tell him.
Okay, and this is something that I want us to consider when it comes to how is it that the personal becomes part of the narrative? How is it to write from personal experience, and how is it that we address how is it that we address the lives of those who are no longer with us, particularly after a social traumatic event that marked in so many ways the United States, and there were a lot of events and statues and monuments memorializing the lives of people whose lives perished as a result of this horrible attack. And yet, there remains a series of individuals who were never found, and because of their status of being undocumented, whose lives, whose stories we will never know. And just before we transition to the open conversation about this, I just want to, if you could indulge me for 3 minutes or so, I just want to share with you the ending of this chapter, but I want you to pay particular attention to how she brings in poetry, how she brings in her research, how she brings in testimonies, how she brings in the narrative, the stories, how she imagines too what it is like to write about those lives. So as I finish reading this, we'll open it up for discussion. If you can just put the next slide so that we're thinking about the things. And this is related to, this is the end of this chapter on Ground Zero, it's called. There was also Fernando Jimenez Molina, who worked at a pizza shop nearby, delivering pies and washing dishes. He was 19 years old. My brother is 19 years old. Jesus Christ. The hair above my brother's lip, he's so proud of it that he doesn't shave. He writes spoken word poetry and keeps a dream journal. I bought it for him. It has Batman on the cover. He collects comic books. Fernando had 2 roommates undocumented like him, and they called his mom, and when he didn't come home on the night of 9/11, a local Mexican organization looked everywhere for him. He was gone. The Twin Towers fell shortly before 10 a.m. Who wanted a pizza delivered that early? Probably a finance bro, cooked up after a long night lying with numbers. Maybe he was high on Adderall, hadn't eaten in 24 hours and was finally hungry, but only for pizza. Probably a little older than Fernando, maybe 22 or 23, Harvard grad. Bro, is that my pizza? Fernando's mom didn't want him to come to America. He went anyway. He grew out his hair into a ponytail and grew a beard. That's what the newspapers say. But he was 19, and I know 19. Nice beard. His sneakers were clean, white like a fool's. My father always told his teenage co-workers not to get white sneakers, and they always did anyway. Slaves to fashion, earbuds in his ears, Metallica, Mexicans and their Metallica. It's not racist when I say it. It was bright and sunny that day, his life ahead of him, the day ahead of him. His mom's still young. He could still change her life. He could still tell his father off. The pizza delivery will net him $5. That's a calling card. He could call his mom, but the entire card will be spent on her sending him blessings. He wanted to buy her a house, a garden where she could grow her own flowers. She loved marigolds. Not bodega flowers like rainbow-colored carnations, marigolds. The house will have 1 room for her and an office where she could read her Bible. The edges of the pages were colored gold. He will get his mom a dog so she wouldn't be lonely. She liked frilly things, so maybe she liked a poodle. but he wanted to earn her a German Shepherd, something to protect her. Bark if anyone but him approached the house. So many people had heard his mother, but not again, not under his watch. His mother, his saint. Sometimes he'd swing by her salons and steal the lady magazines and send them to her. Sometimes when he called, she described the dresses she loved by the magazines over the phone, and he resolved to buy them. She loved silk. His mother never knew silk. He'd make her know not silk. He'd make her know death. He made her know silence. He'd make her know the death mask of a man disappeared, incinerated, and gone. Fernando Jimenez Molina, was he ever alive? Did you know that before dialing Mexico, you have to dial 011? There are so many numbers to dial to get to your mother. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 0. You learn those numbers young. The jet fuel smells thick in the air. The flame and smoke surrounding you. You can only get to 011, and that's enough to make you foreign, to make you other, to make you Mexican. You take out your wallet and put an ID between your teeth so that they can find you when it all collapses. Your flesh may burn, but your teeth will remain and the ID will be there. It's a fake ID. Nobody will ever know you died. Nobody will ever know you lived. So this is such a powerful way of bringing in many, many different themes at once, but including the political role that poetry had in order to rehumanize the experience of this delivery boy whose life was lost, whose mother will never hear from again. And I think it's very important to consider the fact that, Karla, you can tell in this fragment that she obviously talked to the survivors and did her research looking at newspaper descriptions, etc. But I think it's very important to consider also in terms of like mental health, what does the aesthetic, what does art allow us to do? How does art help us grapple with this? And how it helps us sort of restitute again the sense of dignity of the lives of the undocumented people that were lost right during 9/11, but also afterwards, because guess who cleaned the ground zero, right? Who suffered from all the toxic chemicals they inhaled, and people who had all these mental health issues afterwards as a result of such a horrible trauma, and yet no insurance, no Heroes Act money or services. So I think we can stop the slideshow and open it up for everyone. I know there's a couple of maybe people have some questions. Please feel free to.
Yeah, Diana had a question here.
Oh, great.
And she asked, how can we teach our community about accepted social terms that dehumanize their jobs or role in society? I suppose that maybe that, Diana, I don't know if you want to say more or you would like just to answer. Marcelo, if you can maybe, yeah, there she is. Just takes a second.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Yes, basically it is, there are a lot of accepted terms in the community, like busboy or other different terms when it comes to jobs that sometimes I think that dehumanizes how we are, and that sometimes we need to correct our parents or people. But thinking about my experience with my mom, I had the same experience with her, trying to correct her on how to say the proper name in her job. But sometimes I feel it's very difficult because they have already ingrained that into who they are. And that was more of my question on how can we teach our society or community about these terms that is something that we need to change.
Valdivia, you want to say something, or you want me to go?
Yeah, I can go first if you want me to. It is a very good question, of course, but a very hard question. I think many of us face that problem, not only with these particular terms that you're mentioning, but with other ones that maybe they're not related to the immigrant experience, but with that kind of power and balance that you mentioned, that these are terms that they have heard for many years and they have interiorized those terms. And so now it's hard for them to reject them and to understand even that they're not the correct or the best way to talk about themselves, and even to understand why is not the best way to understand to talk about themselves. I don't think there's an easy response, an easy answer, especially that trying to teach someone. I think someone can sometimes can produce the opposite effect. Sometimes that produces reaction towards us. Sometimes that make that family member to see us as a pretentious individual instead of someone who is trying to help them to share our knowledge with them, to share our experience with them, or just to present them a different perspective. And I'm gonna move a little bit away of these terms that you mentioned. Something I study languages, and for a while I was involved in studying indigenous languages. And something that I often, the group I was working with, a frequent conversation was that we didn't like and we opposed that Spanish-speaking people use the term dialect when they're talking about indigenous languages. And we're always very passionate about that, and we're always telling them, no, it's not a dialect, it's a language. You have to say indigenous languages, not dialects. If you say dialect, you are presenting that language as if it has, or it doesn't have value. So you have to stop doing that. But then we went to talk with indigenous people, and they use that term all the time. They use dialect. And again, we, from our college student perspective, trying to teach them, no, it's not a dialect. You speak a language. You have to use language. And there was a reaction of their parts, because by trying to teach them something, teach them the correct term they have to use, in a way, what we were doing is perpetuating the colonialism approach. We as scholars, we as college students, we were trying to teach them something. So I think we need to be very careful with that, the way we approach these situations. I won't say that the best way maybe is just trying to show instead of to teach, trying to use the correct terms, the correct forms when you're speaking with them, even if they keep talking, if they keep using the delivery voice term, the immigrant workers term, even if they keep doing that, you need to keep insisting in using the forms that give respect and show value to these people, hoping that little by little they will follow your example, or maybe not just following your example, that they will actually ask you why that term is better than the other one, and then you can have a conversation rather than trying to change their mind without having that whole perspective. That will be my idea. But yeah, it's definitely not a easy task or easy question. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you, Diana. Another question is from Dagmar, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I'll give you a chance to correct me in a second. Él pregunta, el libro de Karla sin duda es excepcional y escuchar el testimonio en la entrevista de USA Latino es muy poderoso. Hay otros libros que tocan esta problemática de la inmigración, escritos por personas que han pasado por esta situación. Y de ser así, ¿cuál es el diferencial que ha posicionado este libro como merecedor de premios? Voy a permitir que Manuel responda y mientras tanto escribiré la pregunta en inglés para los que no hablan español.
Sí, muchas gracias. No sé si quieres agregar algo más, Tamar, o indicarnos cómo pronunciar tu nombre.
Hola, ¿qué tal? No, bueno, básicamente, and we can talk in English, it's okay, but it's easier for me to write it in Spanish, the question, so answer it in English, or okay, that. No, I just wanted to know, because there may be many books about immigration, about what's happened. What makes this book so special that it won awards and that it makes a huge difference on how we perceive immigration? I know you have been talking about this already, but in comparison with other books that have been before.
Yeah, thank you. I think the other one that comes to mind, and I got up and got it, this is The Children of the Land. This is by Marcelo Hernandez Castillo. This is also a memoir of someone who was formerly undocumented and became documented. And I think it's the process, and then eventually acquired his green card because he was able to do so through the partner. And this is also from 2020. So you could see a lot of times both Marcelo and Karla discussing their experience writing about undocumented history. But I think obviously the initial attention that Karla received is definitely because she had already become known and had been offered deals to write a memoir when she published in 2010 that article for the Daily Beast about being an undocumented person at Harvard 2 years before the passage of the DREAM Act, right? And so this is 2010, we're talking about 2012, right? 2012. And I think that gave her a lot of visibility, and back then she didn't accept, but after Donald Trump won, something had to be done. And I think this is what encouraged both of these writers to really go ahead and finish what they had originally started, because obviously this is the result of many, many, many years. Thank you for correcting me, Elizabeth. Yes, the DREAM Act was never approved in DACA. And yes, it's I think this one got a lot of attention precisely because of this form, because it's a combination of journalism, ethnographic field work, and obviously a part of memoir. But we don't get to hear her story; we get to hear the story of others versus a personal journey of growing up undocumented in the United States and making that trip back to, in this case, to Mexico. I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind is the fact that in 2000, at the early last year, there was a whole discussion about a trending topic that caused by American Dirt, which is this book that also narrates the story of migration, written by an American author who hadn't before identified as having Latinx heritage. And that became very controversial because she received a 7-figure contract when a lot of Latinx writers didn't have access to, or didn't have, weren't afforded this kinds of offers. And so this is, there was a hashtag called Dignidad Literaria precisely to talk about the 3% and of Latinx in the publishing industry. And I think this is still a major issue because they lack the platforms. And so in terms of, obviously there's an argument in terms of the literary aesthetics, but there was also this urgency, especially during the presidency of Donald Trump. There was a sense of urgency to really, really have access to material from people who have experiences. And this is obviously not to say that only people who have experiences can write about it, but I think there's something about access, platform, and there's something about the relationships with the kind of communities. And I think the last thing I will say is like how not to be extractive, right? How not to be extractive from these communities without necessarily giving back, and also how to honor and respect their needs and wants and desires. I think you're familiar with the controversy of the American dirt, I see.
Thank you. That's very good.
We have two very good questions. Francesca, I'm gonna skip your question because I think it's a really good place to end. So I'm gonna engage with Marie Price's questions first, because I think the other one leaves us on a very good note of like how to think this and how to use what we are discussing here today forward. So Marie Price, she's a professor in geography at GW, asked us that there, as she mentioned, there is an added power in this book by telling stories of undocumented Americans living far from the border in places like Flint, Cleveland, and Staten Island. Do you think moving away from the U.S.-Mexican border allowed for a deeper sense of belonging and embeddedness? Marie, I know you work on these topics too, and as a geographer, I would like also to hear where your take is on it. I have mixed feelings about it, and I would like to hear what my colleagues here, you included, think about it, because I think it makes the book more powerful, in which it makes you think of immigrants outside of the typical places like San Diego, like Miami, etc. By bringing Flint, by bringing the rural Ohio. She keeps talking about rural Ohio. She doesn't bring Cleveland as much. She keeps emphasizing the rurality of it and not having a car and all that. At the same time, there is a lot of racism in these small communities because there is less knowledge or less familiarity of like an accent, people of different colors, different skin colors, and understanding what's an immigrant, what it means to be an immigrant. So I can see both ways. In a way, it's like if those small communities might be more tight knit. At the same time, they are living surrounded by xenophobia or racism or lack of even knowledge of what it's, an immigrant in those communities that can also complicate their lives. In many ways, being an immigrant, particularly a Latin American immigrant in Miami, might be a lot easier because you can use Spanish language. So you can live your whole life in Miami without really having to use English, depending in what areas or where you navigate. That could never happen if you are a person who had happened to move to the middle of Cleveland or a rural area of Cleveland, which makes your adaptation or your incorporation a lot harder. So I don't have an answer. I can see both things depending on, many, what we sociologists call the context of reception. So those they can be even like very, very little, at the very neighborhood level that affect your lives.
Can I speak? Yes. Oh, wonderful. So this book, I read it, I don't know, 6 months ago, and it blew me away. I love the writing is so powerful, and the point of view, she takes no prisoners. It's just, I'm going to tell you as the way I see it. But I had to think, writing in English and writing as well as she does in English, she's trying to tell a story, the obsession, even right now, if you turn on Fox, it's the border, it's the border, it's the border every day, as if like, she's saying, no, it's with you, even in Flint or even in places. And so for me, whether, I guess it makes the reality of the undocumented experience something that is pervasive in our society. It's not just stopping at one place. And I don't know if that doesn't, I'm sure racism is probably more extreme in Ohio than, I don't know. Racism can be terrible everywhere. But I think for an American audience, or at least an audience who's reading English, there's a power in that because it's not always the usual suspects. And that was my take on it. Whether it changes people's minds, I don't know. Some minds are hard to change.
Yeah, thank you, Mary.
I think it was very powerful to sort of rewrite the geographical coordinates with with which we associate the presence of undocumented people, and I think we've seen this through this COVID pandemic, right? In terms of like what there are these meatpacking plants, in terms of and all this COVID in the spread of COVID because they don't have the protections that they need, and I think it's very historically it's been, I think the figure of the undocumented person is rendered ahistorical, as if they just show up, as if they were not like a historical presence, or obviously there's reasons like the Mexican community in Atlanta, the Summer Olympics, they stayed because they went to build these places, and so we have a very important Mexican diaspora in Atlanta. We don't always think about the South in terms of the Mexicans. I have a colleague at Maryland who did work in Arkansas when there was this migration from LA to Arkansas to work in chicken factories in the 90s, right? So together with Asian refugees. So you have like this different idea of the New South, and the El Nuevo South, that's what she terms it. And I think it's very important to consider the sort of like the historical dynamics and the power shifts that take place for these kinds of migration to occur. And I think the fact that when we think of Flynn, we definitely don't think about the Latinx community, right? Certainly, when we think of Ground Zero, I think this is why I chose to just share that part. We never think about the undocumented workers who suffer physically, mentally, psychologically, the aftermath, and who have remained historically invisibilized from our narratives about this foundational event in American history, right? That shifted how American position itself to the rest of the world in relationship to the world. And I think, yes, I'm not sure whether it will change people's minds. And if this pandemic doesn't, I'm not sure what could, unfortunately, because if they don't care, we don't have what to eat. And we go to the grocery stores and we see shortages because of there's not enough lettuce produced in California or something like that. With the climate change, but also with the lack of support for farmers and for migrant workers. So thank you for that question, Mary, and thank you for joining us too.
Manuel, Manuel, I think we have 2 more questions. I don't know if you want to try to ask one of them, one in particular. We have not the very, very first one, Natalia, I think it was her, and Francesca's question.
Oh, yes. And then we can finish with Francesca, I think.
Okay. So I can try to answer the first one about the message that Karla wants to communicate to the children of immigrants. I don't know if she wants to communicate just one message or if there's one message that we can take from the book. I will say that after reading all the chapters, some message will be, yes, you have this responsibility with your family, with your community as an immigrant, but also you have a responsibility to yourself. The fact that she's not afraid of speaking about her problems with health, and the fact that she's not afraid of doing that, and it's something that many societies in Latin America don't like to deal with when they are having when they're going to stress situations. They don't want to talk about that. They don't want to share about that because it's not only a sign of weakness, but it's not culturally accepted. Like, you have to accept your suffering. So the fact that she's not afraid of saying, yes, I have this problem that sometimes makes me stay in the floor of my bathroom for many hours, and by doing that, I think she's doing this, presenting these two perspectives. Yes, you have this responsibility to your community, but don't feel afraid of have that, assume that responsibility also for yourself. You are part of two communities, and you have the right to be part of those two communities. And each one of them has good things and bad things. Just embrace them and don't be afraid of that. And I don't know if this qualifies as a message, even if in a way she says that in the introduction of their book. She says, "This book is for young immigrants and children of immigrants. I want them to read this book and feel what I imagine young people must have felt when they heard Nirvana's Smell Like Teen Spirit for the first time in 1991. I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness, and I remember what I felt listening to smells like Teen Spirit for the first time." Then she describes she went to the bathroom, she chopped her hair, etc. And then the last sentence of the introduction, "This book will give you permission to be free. This book will move you to be punk when you need to be punk." So in a way, that will be the message, like embrace those two communities, embrace the challenges of those two communities, good things and bad things of those two or three or four communities in which you live in, those communities you are part of. And yeah, just it's time to fuck some shit up. So yeah. Yeah.
Okay, we'll move on
Francesca.
to the last question, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll finish for today, and we wanna. Okay, so I guess I'll read the question aloud. How can we, the Latinx community, become part of the dialogue in the social justice movement in the United States? There's a sentiment among the Latinx community we're omitted in the racial conversation for improvements. Oof, yes, Francesca, thank you so much for such a wonderfully complex question. I can think of three things. Obviously, the first one is that we have to know our history, and this is very cliche, but this is very true. And to think about the ways that, for instance, in my class, in our classes, we always talk about the historical presence of Spanish in the United States 100 years before English, and what that means, and how to think of it as, how to think of the Spanish-speaking communities as part of this nation. And I think it's very important even just to think of that, not to think of Spanish as a foreign language, in the same way that we don't think of English as a foreign language, right? Obviously, Native American languages are the languages, but this is not how we usually conceive of our communities. I think also we need to understand, and obviously study, but also understand the presence of Latinx communities in the United States is always the result of the presence and interventions of the United States in those Latin American countries for the most part. This is true of Cuba. This is true of Puerto Rico. This is true of the Dominican Republic. This is true, obviously, of Mexico. This is true of Central America and the Civil Wars. And so there's like a very, very complex set of policies and interventions and imperial projects, right? So, and I think we need to understand the sort of the legacy of coloniality and how that becomes part of how basically that marks the communities and the histories of Latin American nations vis-a-vis the Latinx communities in the United States. If there's something that is constant, is this flow of migration. And so we need to understand those dynamics. And I think part of the reason why we're not as present or as prominent in these discussions is because white supremacy has managed to divide us. And so we lack the spaces to enter into dialogue. Just like we lack spaces, even at our microcosm of UW, we lack spaces like this one in order to exchange ideas, to come together and communicate with each other so that we can engage our peers that belong to other interracial groups, like the Asian Americans or African Americans. The fact that we say Afro-Latinx, it says tons about how Latinidad is not imagined as Black, but that is not true. And so how can we, the Latinx community, become part of the dialogue in the social justice? We have to learn our history, we have to be able to listen, and we have to ask and then occupy this for spaces in order to, to join these efforts. And I think that we've seen a lot of manifestations of solidarity obviously in the summer, and also the support of especially meat packing workers and also agricultural workers, the intersectional alliances that are needed. I think I'm just rambling here, so I'm sorry for that, Francesca, because this is a very complex question, and I'm thinking with you all. And so, yes.
And thank you for asking that question, because this is the type of questions that we want young people to be thinking about and to be engaged, not remain passive.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. No, please. I think this is, Francesca, this is exactly what we need to be discussing. One of the things that I'm very mindful is like, how is this discussion reflected on my very own syllabi? Right? This is a question that I ask myself. And I think this is a question you should be asking of your other professors too, and in your groups. How is it that we're engaging others? How is it that we invite others to come into dialogue, right? And I think this is definitely a thing of praxis and not theory. So you will have to walk the walk, literally.
So I think we're out of time. I really appreciate, or the panelists really appreciate you sticking with us even past the hour. The conversation, I think it's very interesting. We enjoyed reading the book. I hope if you read it, you enjoyed or suffered through it, because it has a lot of poignant stories there. And if you didn't, that you read it, and we'll be happy to engage in further conversations on these. Victor, Manuel, I don't know if you want to say any parting words before the weekend.
Yeah, no, again, thank you all of you for coming. And yes, if you didn't have the opportunity to read the book, do it. Yeah, it's painful, but it's necessary. The prose is fantastic and powerful. So if you didn't do it, please read it. And we hope to see you next semester in live to continue this project. And yeah, thank you for all your questions.
And I'm actually going to be discussing with my students this book and an excerpt from this book in my last class on April 21st. Send me an email if you want to come to class. I'll send you the link. We'll be discussing this book again in the larger context of these discussions of undocumented testimonies is what I titled the class for that day. And thank you for honoring us with your presence and your time and supporting this event, because we need more events like this, but they wouldn't be successful without your presence. Así es que muchísimas gracias. Y ojalá en persona lo podamos hacer bilingüe o en Spanglish como debe ser, in true spirit de lo que estamos discutiendo. Y bueno, hasta luego.
Buen fin de semana.
Buen fin de semana.